I and people who believe the way that we did, were saying that a continuation of the policies was going to lead to higher inflation and more unemployment. It represented a recognition that fine efforts to produce paradise on earth were producing something very different than what was intended.
Friedman argued that any attempt to put money into the economy to make it grow was doomed to failure. But he was not challenging the idea of the economy as a predictable system, only how it worked. He considered his laws were as powerful and objective as those of the physical sciences.
It was scientific. Inflation is not a communist phenomenon. It's not a capitalist phenomenon. It's a printing press phenomenon. That's a scientific statement. And you will only have inflation if the quantity of money increases more rapidly than output. You can only stop inflation by slowing down the rate of monetary growth.
Monetarism offered an attractive technical explanation for the problem of inflation. But from it would come in less than 10 years another scheme for Britain's salvation. A set of scientific rules which, if the politicians followed them correctly, would create the right conditions for economic growth. It began with a disillusioned group of economists. They included two influential journalists, Peter Jay of The Times and Sam Britton of The Financial Times.
We were found to be stimulating and interesting, which are the English words for damning people. And we were always regarded as good for a puzzling interlude in a program such as this.
Of a complete runaway inflation and an internal collapse of confidence in the currency.
I'm sorry, I think, Mr. Britton, that's an exaggeration when you start talking about the runaway inflation in Germany after the First World War. I think, quite frankly, that that's an exaggeration that can't be sustained by anyone.
But I think...
Can we stay on our home ground for the moment?
Yes.
If there was one place where we tended to bump into each other, it was the Institute of Economic Affairs.
We set up a table here to maximise the array of people that we could fit in. We could probably fit in 20 or 25 people in this small room. And he would develop his argument briefly, very emphatically, in strong form. And he would say, if you want details of this and particular episodes in American history, I can go back to that. And then the discussion would take place.
To start with, I must admit, I didn't believe the monetarists for a moment. This seemed totally implausible. This was the sort of economics that I'd been told to discard for all the time I'd been learning economics. It was a joke, really. It wasn't to be taken seriously. Whatever else one used to explain inflation, it wasn't the money supply.
In February of 1974, Edward Heath's government fell, amid power cuts, a 3-day week, and never-ending inflation. They were direct consequences of his crude dash for growth. The time was ripe for the monetarists, in particular Alan Walters, a professor from the London School of Economics. He began to attract both press and politicians with apocalyptic warnings of what was to come.
A reduction in output, an increase in unemployment, and at the same time, rampant inflation. Inflation of the order of perhaps 30%, perhaps even increasing as we go on. There is a real danger of hyperinflation.
Alan Walters had snubbed me when I went back to meet old friends. Once the government fell and I was back as a member of Parliament without a government post. And Alan Walters refused to shake my hand. He said, "You've been debauching the currency. Why should I welcome you back?" And I started to rethink what we'd been up to, and a fellow called Alfred Sherman was very influential in convincing me. He used to say, "Don't you know, Keynes is dead, Keynes is dead." I didn't understand what he meant.
He turned to me for help, and I managed to persuade him to go further and look at the whole Keynesian mumbo-jumbo, the panacea.
Keith Joseph toured the country, translating monetarism into a political programme. The primary job of economics was no longer to create employment, he said. It was to reduce inflation.
After having failed to persuade the shadow cabinet to reconsider our economic policies, I warned them that I'd have to make a speech. Well, the speech was made. I remember I I remember that I said to Sam Britton, who looked at one of the drafts, this speech has been through 9 drafts. We're trying to get it right. And Alfred Sherman from the background said, yes, and I wrote 13 of them. Well, we slogged at that speech. Is threatening to destroy our society. The distress and unemployment that will follow unless the trend is stopped will be catastrophic. Inflation is caused by spending more than we produce, too much money, chasing too few goods, deficit financing, printing money. Mild inflation seemed a painless way of maintaining full employment, encouraging growth, and expanding the social services. We now see that inflation has turned out to be a mortal threat to all three.
But Labour was in power. As before, they had inherited the chaos of a Conservative boom. Yet this time, none of the traditional Keynesian methods offered them any help, because inflation and unemployment were rising together. It was something the Keynesians believed impossible. By the end of 1975, the economists advising the government were lost.
My memory is, I think it was a dinner party, deliberately organised, where the main economic modellers were there. The Treasury was represented, the Bank was represented, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, London Business School. I was a fly on the wall, and they were talking about the medium-term projections in their models. And they were unanimous that they could not project what was going to happen to inflation or to unemployment or the balance of payments. There was almost total agreement around the room that the UK was in serious danger of going to absolute decline. That was negative growth, not just growing at a slower rate than other industrialised countries. That is when the civil servants in the Treasury and the Bank of England realised that the UK economy had arrived at the brink of the abyss. They had sight of the awfulness of what that abyss might look like, and they were shell-shocked as a result of it.
Then, in March 1976, Britain fell into the abyss.
2030, 2030. Change it! Change! 2025.
Foreign investors, led by American bankers, panicked. The pound began to slide against the dollar, and nothing would stop it.
Sorry?
It's lost 2025 and stop it.
10.25, stock it. It dropped 100 points. We don't know why. It just dropped 100 points when everything else was staying sturdy.
Britain faced bankruptcy. In desperation, Labour turned to the International Monetary Fund for a loan. An IMF team came to London. They were determined that the only way to restore confidence was for the British government to adopt monetarist policies. In a speech that could have been written by Keith Joseph, Prime Minister James Callaghan told the Labour Party why it had to do what the financial markets wanted.
We used to think that you could spend your way out of a recession and increase employment by cutting taxes and boosting government spending. I tell you in all candour that that option no longer exists, and that insofar as it ever did exist, it only worked on each occasion since the war by injecting a bigger dose of inflation into the economy on every occasion, followed by a higher level of unemployment as the next step.
It was presented scientifically, but then they're always presented scientifically as being the only way of doing it. There is no alternative. And this gripped people, but at the same time you must never forget that politics is in the pursuit of an interest and an ideology, and if the scientist helps you with the ideology, you use him. If he doesn't, you disregard him. So the conflict between, as it were, Milton Friedman and Keynes was a political conflict. It wasn't really that it was people solemnly assessing the different values of two sets of ideas. One benefited one group, another benefited another.
In December 1976, the IMF granted a loan to Britain. That same month, Milton Friedman was awarded the Nobel Prize. In just 5 years, his economic theory had moved from the margins to centre stage. It was seen by many politicians as the only solution to Britain's disastrous economic position. And waiting in the wings was Friedman's most devoted follower, a politician who believed it was possible to use monetarism as the basis of a plan to regenerate the country.